happy to be back with you today. I've been doing a series at these satsangs of 5 things that I learned from the life of Paramahansa Yogananda, from studying about his life, from reading about his life, and also, of course, from my own spiritual teacher, Roy Eugene Davis, who is a direct disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. So we can learn from our teacher what their teacher taught them. And so each month I have been talking about different lessons. And the first one was, well, they're all about how to live a spiritually conscious life, right? So the first lesson was be intentional. Wake up and don't let your life drift by, but decide you will live with higher purpose, which is what we see in the lives of the great ones like Paramahansa Yogananda at the age of 27, who embarked on this journey from India to America. It took him 3 months to get here by ship. And he felt strongly, he knew that his work in life was to bring the teachings of yoga to the West. And when we think about what it was he was up to, he had this very high vision that he would bring a universal teaching, that no matter what a person's background or religion or ethnicity, they could have this method that would allow them to experience the truth of their being directly, with the boldest assertion that it is possible for you, for anyone, to know God, if they only have this way of knowing how to do that. So at the heart of that intentionality was the desire to remove suffering in all of its forms, to save people from the bondage of suffering, at the core of which is the idea that we're separate from God. At the root of all suffering, if you get right down to it, is this, what the Vedas call the erroneous idea that somehow we have an independent existence, that somehow we're just egoic beings and we're abandoned out here to make it on our own. And we're identified then with the ego self, with the mind, with the body, and we don't realize fully that we are spiritual beings, that we are anchored in the life of God, that God is indeed our life. So his purpose when he came here was to remove suffering, to teach people how to do that. And the next lesson I learned in watching his journey, and of course watching my own teacher, is that when you want to live your life with purpose and you have a sense of what you're up to, you have to stand for that purpose. You have to arrange conditions in your life so you're focused on living it. And then, sort of paradoxically, you have to stay open. Because any of us who are about our life in a purposeful way want to stay open to the activity of divine grace. And there is, because we are divinely connected to the one life, the one presence, the one power that is all that is, it will arrange conditions for whatever you need to live your higher purpose. Whatever you need to know, it will come to you, or it will arise within you. Every day you can see that happening if you begin to live your divine life. And it will happen in ways both great and small. So this morning, very early, just about sunrise, I went out for a walk, and I had been wondering about my next door neighbor. We have a family who lives next door, and the grandmother in the family lives in a grandmother unit upstairs. And usually, occasionally, I see her. I hadn't seen her for a long time. And I was just wondering, how is she? And just on the edge of going and knocking on the door, and how is she? So when I went out for my walk this morning and I was coming back, there she was coming out to get her newspaper. Spirit arranged that. So I could just talk to her, ask her how she was, and learn, why I hadn't seen her for a while. So in ways like that, you will find yourself in the right place at the right time. But you have to stay open to those impulses that will come to you from the soul. So ordinarily, I don't go for a walk early on Sunday morning because I'm getting ready to come here and be with you. My husband is very prompt. He gets the car ready, and then he begins to pace while I'm still getting ready. But this morning, I thought I should go for a walk before I leave this morning. If I hadn't listened to that prompt, if I hadn't stayed open, then I wouldn't have had the meeting that answered my question. So in order to be intentional about what we're up to in living our higher purpose, we also have to stay open to the promptings of the soul. And then the third thing that I learned from Paramahansa Ji's life, I want to share with you today, which is decide to be happy. Are you ready for that? Yes. Oh, it's so good. Because I was not ready for that. I really did not get it. It made me a little mad, actually. I really had to look at that. So Paramahansa Ji, when he came here on his mission, he said, and remember, what he was up to was freeing people from suffering. And at the root of that, if you can free people from their suffering and from this erroneous idea that they're separate from one another, separate from the earth, separate from God, you can heal the whole world with that. That's the key to peace on earth. So he had just come through the First World War, right? 1920, when he came, the ship that he came over on was the first passenger ship to sail from India to the US after the war. So that's where he was going. And of course, during his lifetime here, the Second World War. But what he said, many people may doubt that finding God is the purpose of life. But everyone can accept the idea that the purpose of life is to find happiness. Why? Because we're all searching for it all the time. Right? From the moment we get up in the morning. I mean, we don't get up and say, I'm going to go look for suffering today. We're all wired to try to find ways to avoid suffering. But everyone can accept the idea that the purpose of life is to find happiness. I say that God is happiness. God is bliss. God is love. God is joy that will never go away from your soul. So why shouldn't you try to acquire that happiness? No one else can give it to you. You must continuously cultivate it yourself. Now, here's the rub. I was a little annoyed by this teaching when I first came about be happy. Even though I liked Bobby McFerrin's song, and I could hum along, it just wasn't quite how I lived. So I really had to study what that was about. And what I discovered was that I had a commitment to unhappiness. And I also discovered that I was not alone. There were many reasons that I had the commitment to unhappiness. The first one that I thought was, everybody needs to know that I'm unhappy. So if everybody knows that I'm unhappy, they know I don't accept the way things are, and they better change and shape up. So I had that since I was a child. It never worked, but I had that commitment. And as I began to study, I learned that actually that is the commitment of the ego self. That the ego is committed to unhappiness. So I'm telling you this, you don't have to believe it, but you start to study. You start to study yourself and you start to look at this. So why would I say that the ego is committed to unhappiness? Because the ego is just the idea of the false self. It's the idea of a separate self. So if we're separate from the source, there's always something missing because we are never whole. You cannot be whole in separateness. Are you following me so far? So that's the gig of the ego. So in order to keep maintaining this idea of separate self, ego has a complaint. There's something missing. There's something wrong. And in an odd way, ego is right. Because what's actually missing is our connection to ourself. So here's the craziness of it. I thought that my commitment to unhappiness, my steadfast commitment to complain and make sure that people knew what was wrong, I thought that was a commitment to telling the truth. I felt unhappy. Why should I say that I'm happy? I didn't like the way things were. Why should I say that I like the way that they were? Wouldn't that be untrue to myself? But what I discovered was I was actually being untrue to my true self. I was being untrue to my true self. Because my true self is whole. My true self is complete. My true self does not have a complaint. My true self is not at all unhappy. So when we look at this teaching on our path that says, decide to be happy, and you can decide to be happy, we can ask ourselves, where is my commitment? What am I committed to? Am I committed to unhappiness? Am I committed to happiness? Now, there's another little rub with this, I understand, and many of you are looking at me with that face. It looks like this. I'm going to think about this. So let me explain. Teaching doesn't say you have to be happy. That's a side effect. The teaching says, learn how to be content. Learn how to be anchored in the fullness of yourself and be content. And then it says, once you learn how to be content within yourself, you will experience supreme happiness, which is happiness that is unconditional. It's not external. It doesn't depend on other people. It doesn't depend on circumstances. It arises because it's the nature of your own soul. It's the nature of the joyousness of your own being. So when we learn how to be content, we have access to that happiness. So I think it is a little problematical when you just jump right in and you've had this long time commitment like I did to being unhappy. It's really hard to turn the switch and say, okay, I'm happy, because it doesn't feel authentic. But if you really practice, if you really look at what the teaching says, you can certainly go into learning what is it to be content. See, we get on this trip where we think, I'm going to find happiness, like as soon as everybody straightens up. And right now, we're in a whole collective mess in our nation. If we want everybody to straighten up before we can be happy, we're going to have a heck of a ride. So we're on this thing that says, okay, I'm going to find happiness. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I don't know what we're going to do, but we're going to do it, and we're going to find happiness. And then when we find that happiness, we'll be content. We'll have contentment. But our teaching tradition says, whoa, wait a minute, that's backwards. Find contentment, which you can find at the soul level of your being, because you are always content. No one gives that to you. No one can take it from you. No circumstance can disturb that which is your own wholeness, your own being, which is always full, always content. Things come and things go, but contentment is the nature of your own being. So you have that, then you can experience happiness. But if you're always chasing happiness, thinking happiness is going to bring you contentment, you have it backwards. Many of you have heard the fable. It shows up in many traditions, sometimes as the story of Solomon's ring. It's actually kind of traced back to the Sufis, about a king, a prosperous kingdom. Everything was grand. And he asked his wise man or wise woman for a saying that would help him through all times, difficult or joyful. And the saying was, "This too shall pass." That's the nature of life in the manifest realm. This too shall pass. So do we anchor ourselves in that? No. We anchor ourselves in that which does not pass, in that which does not change, because everything else does. And if we try to tie our happiness to that, we're going to have a lot of difficulty. So we find that which does not change. We anchor ourselves in that. We learn how to find contentment in the soul. And we decide to be happy. That is where our power is. Did you ever see a sad saint? And that was a famous saying by St. Francis de Sales, sad saint is a sad saint. And we look at, some of the ones we've been able to see in our lifetime, who are on the edge of the sorrows of the world, or knee deep in it, working for real change, places where there's deep suffering. But they have a joy. They have joy. They have happiness that they take with them. And that's how they're able to help others, because they can lift them up through the power of the Spirit within them. And that power is within us all, to bring that happiness to others. I was reading Rumi. This is National Poetry Month, April. This is called, I'm just going to read a few lines from it. This is called The Thicket. And it's in Feeling the Shoulder of the Lion, some teaching stories from Rumi, translated by Coleman Barks. The Thicket. I love this first line. Don't burn a blanket because of one flea. I love that line because that was my old commitment. Everything could be great, one thing would be out of place. And that's where my mind would go. That would be the source of my unhappiness. So we want to look at, what is our commitment? Are we committed to being perpetually unhappy? Or have we made a decision to be happy? To be anchored in the contentment of the soul? It's a big risk, I know. It really is. You risk people thinking that you're out of touch. But the truth is, you are deeply in touch. The Thicket. Don't burn a blanket because of one flea. Don't waste a day on trivial irritation, some gnat's headache. Take your focus off the forms and focus on what's inside. If you're on this way, choose companions who are also pilgrims. No matter what the shape, color, or national origin, if they are your people, go with them. So deciding to be happy is making a commitment to live the soul life. And it's like a meditation, it's work. Because we are conditioned at that level of the ego to be problem-centered. So we have to watch what we talk about. What's the first thing that we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about our problems. Our problems love it when we talk about them, because then they multiply. So if we have a commitment to be happy, we're going to have to change our conversation. And we're going to have to change our focus. I have another poem for you, which, the other part about having a commitment to being unhappy, which is, by extension, a commitment to making other people unhappy, which I wanted to do, because it was their fault, so. But if you have a commitment to be happy, so when you have a commitment to be unhappy, there's some really weird, twisted idea that you can control things that way. You can let people know that you're really not happy. And it'll change things if you just do that. Do you understand that insanity? Okay. I had a couple amens over here. Those over here are like, all right. So it's this weird idea that you can control other people or situations if you just let them know how unhappy you are. But if you give in to this just being happy, there's a surrender that comes with that that's just about receiving how good life is. And it's kind of big. You just decide to open up to divine love and divine joy it starts meeting you everywhere. And you can hardly contain it. In fact, you cannot contain it. So you can't remain small anymore. This is called lark singing through the night. I've given up the ledger. You know what the ledger is, right? He owes me. I did. Can you believe how hard I worked cooking that dinner for you? You didn't even say thank you. I've given up the ledger. Remain hopelessly in debt. Every time I say thank you, a new gift appears at my door. Every time I say thank you, a new gift appears at my door. Your love has cured me of the madness that imagines I am generous. Now I know I am a spring overflowing, a lark singing through the night, and yes, the full moon shining a brilliant, borrowed light. So when we make this decision to be happy, we naturally rise. And we shine our light into the world in a powerful way. And that's what we're here for. We're not here, as the master teacher Jesus said, to put our light under a bushel. We're here to rise up. We're here to let it shine.